AI-based robots, why should we believe any thought that we have? Because every thought we have is the result of a previous natural cause over which we have no control.
You want to create a God?
You say, as so many claim,
Your own God.
that you are in fact a God.
That's a very good question. Isn't that what man has always done?
A live human body and a deceased human body.
They don't want God telling them what to do.
Structurally, there's no difference.
Can someone say that God is a human invention? How would you respond to somebody?
Just everything comforting, everything that would be comforting was meaningless. It fades and goes. I don't know where I'm going.
There is a real mourning that comes from the death of a higher purpose in somebody's philosophy of life. It's something I've mentioned once before, the sudden calcification I had in my mind that life is, universally speaking, meaningless. In 1901, Dr. Duncan McDowell was certain that there was a soul, and so he conducted an experiment to prove it. The residual impact of the meme that followed may linger in your mind with its conclusion that upon death, the human body lost 0.2 of an ounce. The human soul, it became commonly believed, weighed 21 grams. As it was reviewed, however, and science trimmed off the nonsense from his story, his research was deemed unscientific and inconclusive. For some back then, I wonder if this must have been heartbreaking. The realization, as Dr. Manhattan from the movie Watchmen says, that a living body is no different than a dead one, structurally speaking. And then the process that must have followed, of every scientifically minded believer who heard the news of Dr. Duncan's flaws, to remove this idea of the soul from one's own meaning lexicon, along with all the pleasantries attached to it. The news, for some, must have been somewhat traumatic. This is the dark tone of enlightenment which is often ignored, I think, and one that plagues me way more often than its eureka counterpoint. The moment before something replaces the formerly meaningful. There's an existential vertigo of standing at the top of a tower of misconception and watching in horror as it vanishes underneath you. We're safe now, looking back at 1901. It's easy for us to say, why did they even think souls worked like that? It's like it's a heavy gas or something. It makes no sense. It's almost funny to think about, like that was a soul for them, like a Harry Potter ghost. That cultural transition from horror to acceptance is similar to how it was for me personally, for ideas like truth and free will and the self, all demolished by my own incessant crawl towards meaningfulness. I was broken each time, as one by one the ideas I took for granted got sucked down by the riptide of my own progress through the minds of history's relentlessly thinking people, until there was little left but the ragged rocks of routine life. It can leave you feeling hopeless. The idea of a soul was never something I needed to wrestle with personally. For me, it wasn't hard to imagine something demonstrable and deeply personal that leaves us upon decease. I already had something in that slot, and that thing was ideas. So, this is you, a collection of ideas and beliefs, habits and ethics, tastes, emotionally charged memories. Some of them are reliable and beneficial to your level of thriving. Some of them may be non-beneficial, or erroneous, or flawed. We all have a little of both, and we all continue to change. Each of our mimetic landscapes are in constant flux, bending with the waves of culture and relationships and experiences. I referred to this model in the last video, Doodling Epistemology. And it needs a name, I think, this model. So let's call it the Velt. I've always liked that word, and it does remind me of a field. Throughout this series so far, I've already proposed that we start thinking about truth as an emergence of human interaction rather than a state of things. Things, I said, are nothing more than sensations we share as ideas so that we may thrive. What we may ever refer to as truths are lowercase, practical truths. At first, this may be hard to swallow. It was for me, because before I built this model of the Velt, I didn't have anything. I had no solid conceptual grounding on which I could progress towards anything better. And so even though I wasn't tracking my own Velt at the time, had I been, I would have noticed a heavy bulge in the lower end of this otherwise pretty empty plane, as much of who I was became lost to a sort of pessimism. There was one evolutionarily themed idea in particular, that everything great and seemingly true about this world was viewable to me, but not because of its inherent greatness, but because of those ancestors who viewed it and passed it along, who survived, and it became us. If you think about it long enough, you can see it in almost anything. The color red, for example, has been shown to increase the testosterone levels of many species, and psychologically impact humans in many ways. It's been suggested by science that this is due to its affiliation with blood. The color blue, on the other hand, scientists say has become viewable to us culturally, a perception that our ancestors and some cultures still don't have, simply because they hadn't yet invented the word. Natural beauty is discussed well by Dennis Dutton.
So evolution's trick is to make them beautiful, to have them exert a kind of magnetism, to give you the pleasure of simply looking at them. Consider briefly an important source of aesthetic pleasure, the magnetic pull of beautiful landscapes. People in very different cultures all over the world tend to like a particular kind of landscape. A landscape that just happens to be similar to the Pleistocene savannas where we evolved.
The sexy, the savory, the moral, the joyous, even the value of reasonability can be reduced into a trait of language that evolved solely to sustain itself through the benefit of coherency. Like the very small perceivable frequency range in the spectrum of light that jitters around our nervous system until the residual glow becomes an experience of color. We do not simply see a universe at all. We construct highly personal, anthropocentric worlds from the combination of our evolved anatomy and our evolved collective ideas. As Alan Watts has said, we are living in a Rorschach blot. As long as we are human, what I now contently refer to as the Velt is all we're going to experience. And back then, this horrified me. Because it's dismal, right? I mean, how unsatisfying is that? When I first dealt with this epiphany, I recall tugging at my hair, sitting in the dark, and one night wading out into the cold ocean, desperate that the chill would remind me of something urgent and real to believe in. For some reason in that state, I only wanted to explore the things that revolted me. Back then, all around me I saw people who voluntarily or involuntarily were driven by their instincts. And I was one of them. The dinner I craved, the clothes I wore, the conversation I had, the music I enjoyed, all my values, all determined by something. Social acceptance, gene propagation, survival. Pop culture and politics especially made things worse. These things are so plain when targeted for large groups. Sex, power, food, the avoidance of fear aren't even subtle or disguised in the television ad. And that was my world. A shallow local culture, shallow ideas, and a shallow pop culture. I thought I might lose touch with everything I previously valued. I fantasized about hiking into the woods like Thoreau, unwilling to participate in something as fake as society. And then I detested myself when weeks passed and I was still there, at those same parties, unable to break the dependency. You may already be noticing a trend in this thinking that I didn't notice at the time. But it wasn't just that I was an angsty, privileged young man who kept poor company, watched crap television, and had a dismal understanding of what makes good relationships. It was that I saw no reason to believe it should be any better. This was an idea, as strong as any dogma, that planted in me an inability to transcend my unfulfilled life. That we are slaves to our biology, and if not that, then we are slaves to the words and systems that sustain us. Or as Arthur Schopenhauer famously said, man can do what he wills, but he cannot will what he wills. Luckily for me, we have the internet and centuries of thinkers who exchanged this idea of the ugliness of determinism back and forth so many times during the age of analog internet, aka paper and audio, that's just a click away. There to reassure us that we are not alone in this dark fear. There are those who find it dismal. American pragmatist William James said, "I cannot understand regret without the admission of real, genuine possibilities in the world. Only then is it other than a mockery to feel, after we've failed to do our best, that an irreparable opportunity is gone from the universe, the loss of which it must forever after mourn." Then there are those who find the idea necessary, as is the case for Tom Clark, who in a recent interview said this.
Science-based naturalism, looking at the situation as it arises, will see the choice as a function of the exact conditions that were present at the time. So if you replay that scenario, there's no reason to think that anything else would have happened.
And then there are those who find its necessity compatible with optimism.
You must realize, you see, that this is a problem created linguistically. The way you describe a rabbit will depend on whether you are a hunter or a furrier. It's the way you look at it, the way you describe it, so that the way of describing always varies according to the use you want to make it.
The determinism that fostered a steady depression in me was the launching pad that I leapt from to grab onto the vine I found in Eastern philosophy, which I now consider its counterpoint. This idea is interconnectedness. In the Eastern tradition, this epiphany, the realization that we've lost our agency and our selfhood to what determines us, is not feared or loathed. It's celebrated. I have to admit that the tack in my shoe that kept me out of total cynicism, like some cliche, horny college kid, was sex. Probably everyone on Earth realizes why we have sex. We have sex to reproduce. This is plainly obvious to everyone, and yet here we all are, having sex and enjoying it. So what use in the experience of sex is analyzing the genetic purpose of it? Why consider the selfish nature of our genes to pass and survive in any category other than biology? All it takes for us to analyze a little further to appreciate that the overwhelming sensation of bliss that comes from experiencing sex with someone you love and trust is an emergent phenomenon of billions of years through untraceable variables, biological conditions, and personal emotional experiences that became that sensation. Enjoyment is part of that phenomenon. This is what led me to noticing an inconsistency in my thought. Here I was, labeling all my values as universally meaningless. And I was right. I mean, my values had about as much objective meaning to the whole of time and space as a dragonfly's values. But why would I ever think that they had to? Why does the soul have to weigh something? Why does my purpose need to be ultimate? These weren't the universe's values, silly. They were my values. I valued conversation, despite understanding that it came from a benefit in social dynamics. I valued sex, despite it being a reproductive mechanism. I valued specific foods and beauty and morals despite them being determined and subjective. It is not universality that makes values valuable. It's what we get from them. Hating what I was as objectively meaningless as loving what I was. But I loved plenty of things. I loved intimacy and apple butter and the outdoors and logic puzzles and animals and Calvin and Hobbes and playing music. We may use this idea of determinism, natural or cultural, to shrink down the self, smaller and smaller, classifying our taste for our favorite foods and art and relationships so that we may wipe them completely out of existence until the self has disappeared. And from that, we may feel hopeless. But when the self is gone, what is it that's feeling hopeless? We may just as well say that this pattern of genes feels hopeless. And so is this culture wave, and so is this combination of relationships and ideas, and cells and atoms. And suddenly, the feelings we have aren't so small or meaningless at all. They're profound. That emotivizing I was doing, characterizing our instincts as selfish or heartless, was as unreliable a concept as satanic numbers. It is the same categorical error that we talked about in episode 5. The Welt that makes you feel lost and alone and aimless and purposeless is the same Welt that makes you love life, feel connected to it, and live well. It's just a matter of which part of the Welt we focus on and how we direct it through the ecosystem of ideas so that our models can thicken and bloom. You can be a devout cynic or an optimistic nihilist. You can suffer or celebrate your relationship to the uncontrollable variables that influence your identity. But don't for one more minute call that realism. There is no reality in this sense. There is only your Welt. Because reality isn't emotive. People are. Own that. This question, can we have meaning in our lives despite biologically determined preferences, or without concrete universal realities? Are you kidding? We've got too much. It's all around us in every YouTube channel, in every dance craze, in every morsel of food, packed with context and depth and potential value. You are already teeming with it. So start living that way. Compassionate, deep-thinking people who love life. Make yourself. Show yourself. This world needs more of you. Go, go, go. Get out there. Make things. Stop searching for meaning. Start making it. Start making it.